For many years, the Isle of Wight railway network, known today as the Island Line, has relied upon what you could call distinctive traction. Since the mid-60s, this quirky 8-mile railway has echoed and rattled to the sound of old London tube trains. Be it the well-loved roller coaster 483s or the clean and contemporary 484s, adapted from Metro Camel D stock of the 1980s.
Now, because of this distinctive traction, the Island Line has become an eccentric element of the UK's modern rail network, with stock designed for the metropolis finding its way down to the crisp sea air of the Isle of Wight. This practice then is key to the railway's uniqueness and character. But where did the tradition begin? What were the first London Underground trains on the Isle of Wight?
The first electric tube trains to run on the island were the Class 485s and 486s, originally London's standard stock of the 1920s. These classes were more or less identical, bar the number of cars in a set. The 485s originally consisting of 4 cars and the 486s of 3. These units replaced the ageing steam locomotives and Victorian coaching stock that dominated the island's railway system until the 1960s. Electric replacing steam as part of BR's modernisation plan in 1967.
But although these units pioneered electric tube traction on the Isle of Wight, they weren't actually the first underground trains to run on these rails. To be able to answer that question, we have to go back way further than the 1960s.
If you dig deep enough, you can trace the parallels between the London Underground and the railways on the Isle of Wight all the way back to 1862 and the opening of the first passenger railway on the island. This line was of course the Cowes and Newport Railway, and being the first inherently, they were in need of new rolling stock and turned to a manufacturer. That manufacturer was Wright & Sons of Birmingham, and for the Cowes and Newport Railway they constructed 4 brand new 4-wheeled coaches. But where does the London connection come in? Well, the company that built these carriages actually transitioned into the Metropolitan Railway 1 year later.
The Metropolitan, of course, was the world's first underground railway, opened between Paddington and Farringdon in 1863. It was constructed using the cut and cover technique, the easiest way to build a subsurface railway at the time. Naturally then, the new line needed new rolling stock, and luckily for the Metropolitan, their merger with Wright & Sons meant that they had the ability to build their own.
However, the Met didn't just build stock for their own railway. They also took contracts for other companies. In our case, on the Isle of Wight. The next island railway to order from the Met was the Isle of Wight Newport Junction Railway, who at the time were in a bit of a pickle trying to open their 10-mile route between Sandown and Newport. In 1871, the railway accepted a tender from the Metropolitan to build 3 new carriages. These were delivered in March 1872, but with the Newport Junction Railway Company already in financial hardship, they were seldom used. Getting back to the subject at hand though, were these then the first tube trains on the island?
Well, call me pedantic, but no. You see, these railway carriages may have been built by the world's first underground railway company, but they never were intended to be used on the underground itself. Ordered new for the Isle of Wight in 1871. What we are looking for then are trains that ran on the underground but later were repurposed for use on the Isle of Wight. And as it happens, the stock in question actually ran on exactly the same railway that still continues that tradition to this day.
I am of course speaking of the Isle of Wight Railway, or as we know it today, the Island Line. The railway itself was, at least compared to other island railways, somewhat successful, serving major tourist hotspots along the south-east coast. But although their shiny new Bayer Peacock locomotives were, in the Victorian era at least, considered some of the most prestigious engines on the island, the same could not be said for their rolling stock. much of which at the time consisted of cramped Oldbury coaches from the 1860s. By 1912, the want for larger passenger stock on the line was real, and the railway desperately needed an upgrade.
The Metropolitan just so happened to be upgrading too, and were disposing of some of their older carriages. Now these ones were basically larger derivatives of the ones built for the Cowes and Newport Railway and the Isle of Wight Newport Junction, except for one thing. These carriages were built by the Met for the Met. They were tube trains. The two companies came to a financial agreement in 1913, and 1 year later the first carriage arrived on the island. Outdated and metropolis worn, just like that, the tradition was born.
These carriages were rather unusual. They were eight-wheelers, but in contrast to the standard eight-wheeled bogie coaches of the age, these were of a rigid design, all four axles being bolted directly to the frame. Another distinctive characteristic of the Met stock was the arch at the top of the door frame. This was so the door itself wouldn't hit the tunnel bore if accidentally opened whilst in operation. In total, 18 of these tube carriages found their way to the Isle of Wight.
The Isle of Wight Railway then were well happy. At last, no more cramped ancient rolling stock for their tourist season. Instead, they'd have much larger, roomier trains that were built specifically for high-capacity railway environments. The 1914 summer season was going to be a breeze. Yeah.
In July 1814, the Great War started, with Britain entering the conflict in August. It was a war of attrition, and in England, naturally the railways fast went from being leisurely means of visiting the beach for a holiday to the lifeblood of the war effort. This naturally placed a significant strain on the network, coupled with major labour shortage. The war lasted just over 4 years, by which time the railways had suffered greatly, both from enemy bombardment and general neglect, and very much the same could be said for the rolling stock.
After the war, the Met stock was put to good use, and useful they certainly were. As carriages, they became the most popular passenger traffic on the entire railway. But this elation would not last, as very soon the entire UK rail network was to undergo an overhaul. An overhaul that would spell the end for the Met stock.
This major overhaul was of course the 1923 railway grouping. At the time, Britain's railway network consisted of hundreds of lines run by separate companies. Grouping put a stop to all of that, instead creating 4 railway bodies which could run the entire network split into separate regions. The Isle of Wight then would become part of the Southern Railway, and the new company were keen to cut the chaff and standardise as much as possible. Initially, the Met stock was adopted by the Southern, but soon more up-to-date stock would arrive, and by 1928 the Metropolitan carriages were all but withdrawn.
By this time, the railway carriages were old and obsolete in design, so the chances of selling them off to other railway companies were nil. So instead, they were sold off for domestic use, a practice that was quite common at the time. So what happened to them then? Well, in fact, nothing. They're still here. Now, if you've ever been to St Helens, you may have taken a stroll along the Dover, perhaps on a slightly warmer day than today. But whilst admiring the view, you may have noticed these odd-shaped beach huts over here. Now, these beach huts are odd-shaped for a reason, because they are actually old railway carriages.
How on earth these carriages were transported here baffles me. But here they sit almost 100 years after the last one was withdrawn. Once used by families on sunny summer jaunts to the seaside, now unfortunately a little worse for wear. There may be though a silver lining. See, a little birdie told me recently that soon one or two of these neglected relics may be leaving for a new home. A home perhaps more appropriate for a Victorian railway carriage.
Fingers crossed then, because these carriages are more than just beach huts, organised driftwood on the shoreline. They are a significant part of our railway's history and in their own way completely unique. The basis of how the Island Line remains unique to this day. The origin of the tradition, the first tube trains on the Isle of Wight.